I'm registered dietitian Abby Sharp, and on my new podcast, Bite Back with Abby Sharp, I'll be dismantling the multi-billion-dollar diet industry that keeps us in a cycle of self-loathing and food fear. Join me every Tuesday for expert interviews, engaging conversations, and my signature science and sass to bust myths, correct misinformation, and help you break free from diet culture for good. Listen for free on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The coach came quickly through the small hours of the night, rattling down empty, rain-slicked roads, their stones glistening in the light of its lanterns. The driver banged heavily on the door with the back of his whip, knowing that the sound would be a whimper in the swirling storm. The driving rain that clattered against the parish house was so loud, the priest inside might have slept through the rapping had he not been expecting a visit. That morning, the town doctor had warned him that Saint-Michel would soon be on his way. Slipping on his overcoat and grabbing his Bible and satchel, the priest opened the door and greeted the coachman, who stood hunched in the pouring rain. Boots caked with mud, hat dripping, clutching a sputtering torch in his left hand, the beleaguered driver gave a solemn nod. It was time. The old judge lived in a charming chateau just outside the French village of Le Havre, on a hill overlooking the English Channel, though tonight it was barely visible in the storm. Somewhere, beyond all that blackness, the priest could hear the ocean roar. The judge's grown children met him in the grand hall, and after a brief greeting and consolation, the eldest led the priest up the oak staircase to his father's room. Stopping at the closed door, he insisted on taking the priest's coat and offered an apology. His father had been complaining about the cold, he explained. The priest didn't understand his meaning until he opened the door and was hit by a wall of sweltering heat. The fireplace was thick with blazing flame, washing the room in an orange light. Half-spent logs spilled over the hearth onto the stone floor and were surrounded by a semicircle of black ash and red embers. Directly ahead, the curtains were drawn open and tied, and the fire reflected in the window glass against the backdrop of the ink-black horizon. Long stalks of lavender danced wildly in their pots on the balcony. Occasional streaks of lightning tore through the sky and illuminated for a brief moment the churning chaos of the waters below. At his right lay the judge, the old man's frail frame half devoured by his four-post bed, his gray head propped up on a pillow, staring out at the storm. The priest retrieved a log from the floor and tossed it into the fire, then walked toward the bed until he could see his own reflection in the rain-streaked window. The judge kept his eyes on the storm as he began to speak. "Did you bring what I requested?" The question was barely asked when he fell into a coughing fit. "Yes," the priest replied. He carried a candlestick to the writing table and pulled a thin stack of blank paper from his satchel. The old judge turned his head to look at him. His eyes were as gray and cloudy as a day at sea. "At last, it is time for my confession," he said. The old man's bony fingers rose from the bed, clutched tightly around a silver locket. He stared at it with red, watery eyes, until another fit of coughing forced them to close. When he recovered, his voice sounded weaker and more distant than before. "I have kept these secrets for far too long. I hope that, in confessing, my soul will be at peace. And in prayer, maybe hers will be too." He looked once more at the locket. "My darling Maria." His eyes did not move from their mark, and his voice suddenly took on the authoritative tone of his early days. "You will write down everything I say," he said to the priest. "When I am dead and buried, you will publish my story without exception. Do I have your word?" "Yes," the priest said. "Good," said the judge. "Let us begin."
la religion. Anybody?
You're listening to Fireside Canada, my podcast about Canadian legends, lies, and lore. I'm David Williams. Tonight, a tale of two lovers who might just be the most successful pirates in history. Legend has it that this dreadful duo once haunted the waters of eastern Canada, slaughtering every sailor and sinking every ship they encountered for 20 years. Stories of their exploits can still be found all along the East Coast, from New York to Newfoundland. This is the tragic story of the pirate king and queen of Canada. Part 1. Eric and Maria. In his mind, he sees her standing proudly on the quarterdeck, her raven hair pulled tightly into a braid, the wind playing with the errant strands that cascade over her ears and neck. She wears an English officer's coat, a memento of her first captured prize. A round hole over the left chest is a testament to her readiness with a weapon and her coolness under pressure. The powder-burned fabric speaks to the fearlessness with which she commanded and killed. That was how he chose to remember her, how she was in her prime, during the 20-odd years they spent together as husband and wife, captain and commander, amassing a small fortune plundering the waters in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. That was a long time ago, before their retirement to the coast of France, before he became a magistrate, before things broke apart. Before he was Monsieur le Juge of Le Havre, Eric Cobham was an ordinary seaman. Like thousands of other British sailors, Eric left home as a young boy and went to sea to cut his teeth and learn his trade. More than a few of those early years were spent fishing off the coast of Newfoundland. But the honest life of a fisherman didn't interest Eric, and by the time he turned 18, the young man from Poole was a seasoned member of a smuggling ring, transporting spirits across the English Channel. The job was as lucrative as it was educational, but not without significant risk. Smuggling is a short game, ideal for the young and the foolish. Every smuggler knows that if they do the job long enough and push their luck far enough, that luck will run out. Unfortunately for Eric, fortune came calling the year he turned 20, shortly after he landed the biggest score of his life. It would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. In a feat of remarkable seamanship, Cobham and his crew were able to evade the king's ships that prowled the southern coast and land over 10,000 gallons of fine French brandy on the shores of Dorsetshire. It was a good payday, and after the funds were received, they made port in his hometown. He should have stopped there, but he was young and ambitious, and like many his age, he felt, foolishly, that he was untouchable, invulnerable, as free as the wind in their sails. The King's Navy would soon unburden him of such delusions. The sudden rise in contraband did not go unnoticed by the authorities at Dorset, who petitioned the king to increase the Navy's patrols, and soon they had the smugglers in their sights. The crew didn't see the king's ship until it was too late. It came silently through the fog like a ghost, drawing up alongside them as they sat anchored near the shore, and firing a warning shot across their bow. The crew members who were on land, deafened by the cannon fire, ran into the trees and disappeared. Those who were aboard, like Cobham, were arrested without a fight. Eric was tried, sentenced, flogged, clapped in irons, and thrown into Newgate prison for 2 grueling years. When he was finally released, he tried to make a fresh start and found employment at an Oxford inn. But his employer was cantankerous and greedy. The pay was abysmal, and the hours were long. He soon began to yearn for the freedom that only the sea could provide. Day in, day out, as he mindlessly tapped kegs, washed dishes, and scrubbed floors, he kept an eye out for any opportunity to break free from the weary life of a convict. It came in the form of a purse of gold carried by one of the inn's patrons, a fat, balding oaf who drank too much and talked too freely for the Oxford slums. After the tavern had closed and all the patrons either went home or retired to their rooms, Eric crept into the man's bedroom, slit his throat, and left with blood on his hands but gold in his pockets. His arrest for smuggling taught him a valuable lesson about covering his tracks. Before leaving Oxford forever, he paused long enough to stash a few pieces of gold and the blood-stained murder weapon behind the bar. The next day, as Eric journeyed south to the coast, the ornery but innocent innkeeper was arrested and eventually hanged for the crimes of his former employee, despite the fact that the police were unable to recover any more of the stolen money. Had they checked around, they would have discovered that a significant portion of those stolen coins had found their way to a Bridport shipwright, and Eric found himself in his very own ship, newly fitted with 14 gleaming guns. He wasted no time gathering a crew and setting sail, plotting a course through St. George's Channel and into the Irish Sea. There, just beyond the mouth of the Mersey River, they encountered a merchant ship flying the red and white striped flag of the East India Company. It was almost as if she was waiting for them to arrive. Eric, his crew, and their 14 guns had little trouble taking the ship and the 40,000 pounds on board. That's roughly equivalent to 7 million pounds today. Following his first act of piracy, Eric Cobham again demonstrated that he had learned his lesson to leave no trace behind. He scuttled the ship and ordered his men to slaughter or drown every last member of the opposing crew. The authorities couldn't pursue if there was nothing to find, and in the icy words of Eric Cobham, dead cats don't meow. As the last of the ship and her crew slipped below the icy water, Cobham felt proud of having proven his worth as a pirate. In its maiden voyage, his new ship and crew had captured a prize that was far greater than anything he ever made in his career as a smuggler. Suddenly, the future seemed exceptionally bright for Captain Eric Cobham. Part 2. Cobham and Lindsay. After his success in the Irish Sea, Cobham returned south to the port of Plymouth, and it was there, amongst the drunken chaos and celebrations, where he met his future partner in life and in crime, Maria Lindsay. She was beautiful, smart, charming, and ruthless. A veritable siren, she was able to keep a sailor enamored and entwined for days, bleeding him of his wages until his leave was over or he was pressed to join the Navy. For all his strength and ruthlessness, Eric was not immune to her charms, and soon fell under the spell of her song. They were together for days, living a life of careless luxury, until a significant portion of his wealth had been spent, and his men began to urge him to head back out to sea. Cobham eventually agreed, and begged Maria to join him. It was a request she had denied 100 times before from 100 different men, but this time was different. She had no time for flights of fancy or for the purgatory life of a sailor's wife, starving in a seaside shack with a squalling infant in her arms. But Cobham was not some simple fisherman or some drunken naval officer. He was the captain of his own ship, who didn't want to own her or stow her away in some stuffy home, but bring her with him as his partner, out from the rum-stinking taverns and muddy streets of Plymouth and into the open sea. She agreed. Many on the crew were unwelcoming at first. To the older sailors, a woman on board was bad luck, a grievous error in judgment, nearly as bad as whistling or saying the word pig, the fastest way to a watery grave. For the younger men, she was at best a distraction, and at worst, a source of jealousy and resentment. They put their lives on the line as much as Cobham. Why should he alone have the company of a woman? But Maria, with her beauty and charms, won them over quick enough. First, by using her influence with the captain to grant leniency to a crew member who was about to be punished. Her compassion spared the man's back a good flogging from the cat-o'-nine-tails, and showed that she cared for the crew. Anyone who thought she might be too forgiving quickly learned to eat their words when, later, they watched her personally gut the hapless captain of a Navy brig. Before running him through, she had the foresight and the fashion sense to ask him to remove his blue jacket, then made it a permanent part of her outfit for the decades she spent at sea. Throughout the years, as her officer's jacket became weather-worn and tattered, she would simply claim another one from one of her victims or have a replacement custom-made by the ship's tailor. After taking and sinking a few more ships in the Irish Sea, Cobham began to feel anxious. He had learned not to press his luck, and couldn't shake the feeling that, at any moment, a king's ship would appear out of nowhere and send him back to Newgate Prison, this time to hang. So Eric Cobham and Maria Lindsay decided to sail west across the Atlantic a full 3,000 nautical miles to the 13 colonies. Cobham believed that the heavy amount of trade, combined with the sparse presence of authorities, would make for the perfect hunting ground. And he was right. Their first order of business after arriving on the coast of Nantucket was to raid and sink another unsuspecting vessel. With their stores replenished, the cutter sailed north to the Cabot Strait and into the arterial supply route for all of New France. These waters were rich with merchant ships heading east to Europe laden with furs, and supply ships stocked with payrolls and provisions on their way west to the St. Lawrence River. Most were easy prey, and better yet, no one would suspect a thing. The sea was full of unseen dangers, and a transatlantic voyage was long and risky. If, somehow, a ship failed to arrive at its destination, and there was no wreckage to find, nor any survivors to tell the tale, then many would simply assume that they had been lost at sea. It was perfect. Now they just needed a base of operation. Now, by that time, Newfoundland had been a British colony for over a century, but the British were really only concerned with the eastern part of the island around the port of St. John's, making the western reaches an ideal spot for someone who didn't want to be found. Just around the southwestern tip of the island is a large bay, and hidden deep within that bay was a long, curved peninsula known as Sandy Point. That was where they would make their home, hidden amongst the small fishing settlements of the Mi'kmaq, Jersey, and French, and sheltered behind a wall of treacherous shoals. They would find any ship sailing the strait to be easy prey. Their favorite place to hunt were the waters between the east coast of Ile Saint-Jean, known today as Prince Edward Island, and the northwestern shore of Ile Royale, known today as Cape Breton Island, just a 2-day sail away. And it was there, in what would one day be Canadian waters, where Maria would become not just a leader, but a queen to her crew, proving herself to be a true pirate, even more fearless and more heartless than Cobham himself. The years of practice and study with the crew's most experienced hands had transformed Maria Lindsay into a master of seamanship. With Maria at the helm and a strong wind in their sails, they could pursue and seize nearly any ship on the horizon. And she trained in marksmanship as well. After a particularly bloody encounter with an enemy ship, Maria ordered her men to tie the opposing captain and his 2 mates to their masts. She disappeared below deck and returned moments later with 8 flintlock pistols, all loaded and ready to fire. Over the next half hour, she used the 3 men as target practice, carefully lining up each shot as the tethered men lurched from side to side with the roll of the sea. When she was through and her target sat unmoving and bloodied in the sun, she consigned them and their ship to the bottom of the strait. Routine practice made Maria a crack shot and deadly from a distance. But when it came time to board the enemy, she was truly a sight to behold. Standing on deck in the navy blue jacket she had taken from a dead man, pistol in one hand, sword in the other, fighting alongside her crew. After taking a ship and stowing all its goods, she would order her men to slice up the sails and sew each rival crewman into makeshift sacks, weigh them down with scrap iron or surplus cannonballs, and then drop them wriggling into the sea. The lucky ones were first run through with Maria's own steel and spared an agonizing death by drowning. Her most deadly act, however, came shortly after she and Cobham had seized several cases of laudanum and subdued yet another desperate and terrified crew. While her men held them at sword point, Maria disappeared to the galley and returned minutes later with steaming bowls of stew, fresh from the cook's pot. She invited her captives, and only her captives, to eat their fill of the delicious food while she watched and waited. It didn't take long for the first man to drop. Then the next, and the next, and the next, until all hands lay dead on the deck, poisoned by the legendary, ruthless, and beautiful pirate queen who took no prisoners. Eric Cobham and Maria Lindsay ruled over their secret kingdom for an incredible 20 years, from 1740 to 1760. They were so thorough in covering their tracks, so attentive at destroying every scrap of evidence, that neither the British nor the French governments ever suspected that a pirate crew was prowling Canada's east coast. Any reports they received were discounted as mere rumor or legend, dreamed up by distant colonists with overactive imaginations. But all good things must come to an end. The golden age of piracy was already over before Cobham and Lindsay ever set sail, and the outbreak of war between France and England in 1754 made the region far too treacherous for any enterprising pirate crew. After 2 decades of robbery and murder, Cobham decided it was time to lower the black flag and rejoin civilian life. They sailed back to where it all began, the English Channel, but this time they disembarked on the south side of the water, in Le Havre, France. The fortune they amassed over 2 decades of piracy bought them a luxurious life, and soon the former smuggler and once prostitute were established members of Normandy's upper class. They lived together in an elegant chateau overlooking the sea. They dined with local politicians. They even owned a yacht which they sailed along the coast on warm, sunny days with the help of some of their former crew who they hired on as servants. They had children together, 2 boys and 1 girl, who were given every privilege they could afford, as well as the finest of education. But old habits die hard, and though Eric and Maria had everything they had ever dreamed of, sometimes, when looking out at sea, they couldn't help but miss the excitement of their past. One day, Eric and Maria were out sailing on their yacht, innocently en route to a private picnic for 2, when they spotted a West India brig. The couple hailed and boarded the merchant with every intention of engaging in simple, pleasant conversation, when temptation overtook them. Completely unprovoked, Eric shot the captain point blank in the chest, and Maria, together with her crew, dispatched the rest on board. Their picnic didn't turn out as planned, but it was a good day nonetheless. They sailed their new prize to Bordeaux and sold her to a merchant friend, no questions asked. Eventually, much to their amusement, Cobham and Lindsay earned a reputation as upstanding citizens within their adopted community, and Eric was offered a job as a magistrate and judge. It was incredible to think that Eric Cobham, the career criminal, the smuggler, pirate, and mass murderer, would now be interpreting the law. He readily accepted the position and continued to climb the social ladder with the provincial bourgeoisie, fraternizing, drinking, and womanizing. Maria was initially amused and pleasantly surprised by their new life of luxury and respectability, but as time went on, she grew increasingly lonely and restless. While Eric had traded his cutlass for a gavel, Maria was expected to make a graceful transition from a vicious and commanding pirate queen to a docile and deferential judge's wife. She struggled to fit in and make friends, and to turn a blind eye to her partner's adultery and abandonment. She longed to return to the wilds of Canada, the comfort of her home at Sandy Point, the freedom of the sea, and to the life that she had left behind. Instead, she turned to the bottle for her escape and fell into a dark depression. Then, one windy day, Maria went for a walk along the cliffs outside her home and never returned. The official record stated that she had slipped and accidentally fallen to her death, but many, including her husband, suspected that she had willingly thrown herself into the sea and taken her own life. All that was found were some tattered scraps of navy blue fabric and an empty bottle of laudanum. Cobham continued to live and work as a French magistrate well into old age, with no one ever suspecting that he and his late wife Maria had once, in a former life, moved like murderous ghosts throughout the Gulf of St. Lawrence as the legendary pirate king and queen of Canada. The old judge finished his story and heaved a heavy, raspy sigh. A secret he had kept for decades had finally been revealed, along with all of his guilt and shame. Certainly for the lives he took so many years ago, but mostly for Maria, the woman he loved and had ultimately betrayed. A profound silence filled the chamber, and the old man folded his frail fingers across his chest and gazed out the window once more. The eye of the storm had pushed on, and only the low grumble of thunder could be heard, booming in the hills behind them. The priest finished his writing and sat in silence. The rain came in sheets down the windows. "Are you certain?" he began, his voice as distant and stifled as the storm. He coughed and tried again. "Are you certain you want this to be published?" "Yes," was the judge's reply. "Then it will be done." The priest rose slowly from the table, walked to the bed, and administered last rites. Saying nothing further, he gathered the papers from the desk and, for a brief moment, contemplated the flame that flickered at the end of the candle, now burned to a nub. He prayed to God that the old man's wicked soul would be saved, and hoped, privately, that he would be able to sleep and dream of those days so long ago when he and Maria stood proudly on the deck of their ship, watching the horizon. He slipped the papers into his satchel and blew out the flame. The judge was dead by sunrise. And, true to his word, the priest made arrangements with a Paris publisher to print and distribute copies of the sensational and scandalous confession. However, in spite of the judge's last wishes, the book scarcely saw the light of day. The old man's children had enjoyed the benefits of being part of a wealthy and well-respected family, and they weren't ready to let their father's fantastical deathbed confession destroy what he and they had worked so hard to create. So they suppressed it. Using a significant portion of their parents' considerable wealth, they seized and destroyed the printer's plates and intercepted as many shipments as they could. The few copies that did make it to bookstores were immediately purchased by family members or their agents. Everything was burned in a bonfire on the family estate, and yet, somehow, the story survived. According to legend, at least one copy of that extraordinarily rare book evaded destruction, and now sits forgotten somewhere in the French National Archives in Paris. Part 3. Digging for Treasure. The story of Eric Cobham and Maria Lindsay has been a part of Canadian folklore for at least a century. Historian Donovan Downer tells us that, quote, almost every person who has lived for any length of time on the west coast of Newfoundland has heard something about the notorious pirate pair, and that local people swear by the authenticity of the story, end quote. It's often claimed that Maria Lindsay was the first European woman to live on the island's rugged west coast, and the story can be found in history books, encyclopedias, and in multiple books about pirates and female sailors. There are several legends about priceless treasures supposedly buried by the pirate couple all along the East Coast, including Rhode Island, Cape Breton, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. The distance of time and the romance of the past tends to blur and soften the once sharp edges of violent acts. People who once committed atrocities, outlaws like highwaymen, pirates, and gunslingers, tend to be mythologized, even heroicized, and celebrated. Cobham and Lindsay are no exception. One of my favorite depictions comes from a racy mid-century pulp magazine, just because it's so silly and over the top. In the May 1960 issue of Action for Men magazine, tucked between photos of a leggy French actress and an adventure story about a World War II counterfeiter, lies a particularly pulpy rendition of the legend titled The Two-Ocean Vice Fleet of Maria Cobham. The tale is about what you'd expect from that title and that kind of publication, featuring a 2-page illustration of a perky Maria clutching a cutlass and smiling coyly as she orders a naval officer to strip off his clothes in front of her leering crew, looking sharp in her sailor's bell-bottoms and 1950s bob hairstyle. In the text, Maria is described as a maiden of good family and undisclosed attainments, with golden hair, a piquant upturned nose, and a trace of freckles. Sporting a resplendent coat of blue and silver with flaring lapels, her neat legs and trim ankles superbly set off by white breeches and silk stockings. She learns the art of piracy from her husband, Eric Cobham, and quickly develops an appreciation for bloodshed. And yes, I said husband. A lot of books and articles published throughout the mid and late 20th century referred to Maria Lindsay as Maria Cobham, and made absolutely certain that the reader would understand that the two were 100% a married couple. For audiences and censorship boards of the day, this twosome could rob and kill to their heart's content, but the idea that these two young, bloodthirsty murderers would remain unmarried and living in sin was simply too much to bear. Pulp fiction aside, Maria Lindsay has been the subject of more progressive perspectives as well. She's listed amongst legendary pirate queens and historical figures like China's Zheng Yi Sao, Ireland's Gronya O'Malley, and female pirate superstars like Mary Read and Anne Bonny. All of them were, in the words of writers like Laura Sooke Duncombe and Joan Druitt, inspirations for their courageous and adventurous spirit, with stories that are, quote, often absent in historical discussions because their very existence is threatening to traditional male and female gender roles. They are social outrages and the embodiment of women's terrifying power, end quote. Despite the myth and mystique that we tend to bestow upon pirates, Maria Lindsay certainly was terrifying, at least in the stories. Spending over 20 years at sea, working as pirates and slaughtering every soul they encountered, Cobham and Lindsay racked up a body count in the hundreds, if not the thousands. It could be argued that Eric Cobham and Maria Lindsay were some of the most ruthless, the most murderous, and the most successful pirates of all time, if the story is true. And determining that is much easier said than done, because researching the hard facts of this particular story is kind of a nightmare. A lot of people have written about Cobham and Lindsay over the last century, but few give even a hint as to the origin of their story. Some just do a bit of hand-waving and reference some mysterious unnamed group of biographers, while others simply point to the last book published that happens to mention them, creating a kind of lazy research daisy chain, where everyone references each other, but no one bothers to find the source. A few writers have cited an obscure book titled Lives of the Most Celebrated Pirates, written under the mysterious pseudonym A Sea Captain sometime in the 18th century. Despite it being listed in the back of multiple books as a reference or resource, it seems impossible to find. There are other books with very similar names written under the same and different pen names, but none of those that I could find say anything about Eric Cobham or Maria Lindsay. It makes one start to wonder if that mysterious book wasn't just made up entirely. Now, we're going to get into the weeds of history for a few minutes, but I promise you it's worth it. We're going to try to get as close to the truth as possible, and while that means there's a good amount of debunking ahead, trust me when I say there's still a good amount of intrigue and mystery left to uncover. Now, as far as I can tell, the earliest account of our plucky pirate couple comes from The Pirates' Who's Who, an alphabetical list of sea thieves, buccaneers, and brigands first published in 1924 and written by Philip Gosse, who was, quote, an eminent authority on pirate lore and literature, end quote. Gosse's version is missing a few details that, today, are key parts of the legend. For example, in The Pirates' Who's Who, Cobham doesn't have a first name, and Maria doesn't have a last name. Gosse tells us that Cobham and Maria skulked around Cape Breton Island and Prince Edward Island, but doesn't say anything about a headquarters in Newfoundland. There's no mention of Cobham's stint working at an inn, or of his deathbed confession, and worst of all, there's not even a hint of the years or even the century that they were allegedly active. The author makes a few references to an unnamed biographer, and even provides a few quotations from some mysterious text, but of course he didn't bother to actually provide his sources. Skip ahead a few decades, and the story is much more fleshed out. Cobham and Maria finally have full names. Sandy Point is now their home, and the years that they supposedly ruled Canada's eastern waters are nice round numbers, 1740 to 1760. Most intriguing is that we apparently know all of this thanks to a rare copy of Eric's confession that escaped his family's wrath and was somehow discovered in France's National Archives. This more complete version of the story can be found in respected books like the Encyclopedia of Newfoundland and Labrador, the Encyclopedia of Canadian Organized Crime, and Linda DePauw's Seafaring Women, among many others. But it's still unclear where these details came from. The consensus among history experts like Drs. Jan Rogozinski and Olaf Jansen is that the legend of Cobham and Lindsay was a complete fabrication, likely dreamed up sometime in the early 20th century. Writing about Cobham and Lindsay in his book Pirates, Rogozinski states very matter-of-factly that the couple are a complete work of fiction, and that their, quote, improbable biography appeared in the 1920s in books for tourists visiting Canada, end quote. If that's true, I'd love to get my hands on that book. It would only be about 100 years old at this point and should be somewhat easy to find, but of course, keeping with what seems to be now a tradition for writers on the subject, Rogozinski doesn't provide any examples or sources for his claim. Dr. Jansen, on the other hand, is much more thorough in his debunking, which was published in Memorial University's Newfoundland Quarterly magazine in 2015. His argument boils down to 2 points. The first is the complete lack of historical evidence, which is kind of a big deal for historians. Consider Cobham's supposed deathbed confession. First, Philip Gosse, writer of The Pirates' Who's Who, never mentions it. Then, in 1981, the Encyclopedia of Newfoundland and Labrador declared that several copies of the confession have survived. 3 years later, Harold Horwood and Ed Butts tells us that actually one somewhat defective copy found its way into the French archives, but it seems that no one has actually ever seen it. And it's not for lack of trying. Dr. Jansen notes that he spent, quote, the better part of a day, end quote, back in the late 1980s, personally searching the Archives Nationales in Paris and inquiring at a number of regional archives, only to come up empty-handed. These days you can find almost anything on the internet, but a thorough search of the Archives Nationales online catalog yields 0 results. Okay, so maybe that part was made up to lend the story a little more credibility and intrigue. But what about other documents? I mean, a key part of the story was that Cobham and Lindsay thoroughly covered their tracks, but the western shores of Newfoundland had a few thriving fishing communities. Surely someone over the course of 20 years must have noticed something piratical was happening, either in the Gulf itself or off the western shore of Newfoundland. Well, no. Jansen tells us that he, quote, searched in vain through various British and French maritime and naval collections for any reports, no matter how tenuous, to indicate that piratical behavior of some sort was going on in the Gulf of St. Lawrence during the 1740s and 1750s. Nothing, end quote. The second problem that Jansen has with the story is its timing and logic. Now, piracy was quite a problem back in the early days of Newfoundland. As early as the late 16th century, pirates, robbers, thieves, and privateers were routinely hassling fishing vessels in the area. There was a short reprieve at the end of the 1600s, but pirate activity rose again just a few years later. The high watermark of that era has to be when legendary pirate Black Bart Roberts breezed into the waters off Trepassey in the summer of 1720, black flags flying, war drums beating, and golden trumpets blaring from the deck of his sloop, the Fortune. He stayed for 2 weeks, enough time to seize and refit a new ship, steal some goods, recruit a few new crew members, and cause just a tiny bit of destruction before sailing back to the Caribbean. The appearance of arguably the most successful scallywag of the golden age of piracy likely helped spur a bit of a response from England and France. And that increase in patrols, coupled with the recovery of the ailing fishing industry, meant that piracy in Newfoundland was exceptionally rare by 1730. That means that by the time Eric and Maria showed up in 1740, they weren't just late to the party was officially over. And it's a good thing, too, because Mom and Dad were about to come home. In 1744, war broke out between France and Great Britain in what's known as King George's War. Peace was restored in 1748, only to be trampled again in the so-called French and Indian War in 1754. It was during this time that a colonial force from New England captured the fortress of Louisbourg in present-day Cape Breton Island, and English warships attacked French settlements on the southwest shores of Newfoundland. So it seems a little odd that a pirate crew would be able to operate secretly from Sandy Point in what would have been a war zone. Add to that the fact that furs weren't the most appealing or profitable loot for the average pirate, and you can start to see why Jansen and other historians consider the story little more than colorful fiction. But even if that is the case, there's often at least a little truth to every story. So where is it here? If you read the Wikipedia article about Eric Cobham and Maria Lindsay, or if you do a little more reading or listening on the subject, you'll hear the argument that author Howard Pyle mentions Cobham in passing in his 1891 book Buccaneers and Marooners of America. In the text, Pyle casually notes, as if it was common knowledge, how Cobham, and presumably Lindsay alongside him, attacked a Spanish ship, had the crew sewn into the mainsail, and threw them into the sea. Now, that's true, but it wasn't Eric Cobham he was talking about. It was Thomas. See, back in the mid-1500s, there was a guy named Thomas Brooke, who was the son of the 9th Baron Cobham, a small village in Kent. It seems Thomas was a bit of a wild one, engaging in conspiracy, privateering, and piracy. According to historical records, Thomas Brooke, alias Thomas Cobham, captured at least one Spanish vessel during peacetime, ransacked its cargo of royal tapestries and wine, killed the captain, sewed up the crew, and threw them overboard, then took the ship as a prize, eventually selling the stolen goods to a fence in Cornwall, who then sold the wine to a fellow pirate in Plymouth. Being the son of a baron, he was eventually acquitted. And remember Eric's supposed catchphrase, "Dead cats don't meow"? According to a different legend, that line was actually coined by the 19th century pirate Pedro Gilbert, who, according to actual historic record, raided American ships off the coast of Florida. He was caught, extradited to the US, and hanged for his crimes in 1835. It's easy to see how elements of these stories, Gilbert's catchphrase, Thomas Cobham's cruel acts and connection to liquor smuggling and pool, could have at least partly influenced the tale of Eric Cobham and Maria Lindsay. And it's certainly damning that there seems to be no verifiable evidence that they ever actually existed. But nothing's for certain, and the waters of pirate history have been murky with myth and fantasy for over 300 years, ever since a general history of pirates took the world by storm in 1724 and inspired the likes of Robert Louis Stevenson and J.M. Barrie with its descriptions of wooden legs and eye patches, Jolly Rogers, buried treasure, and more than one pirate who seems to be pure fiction. But just because some of it was embellished doesn't mean all of it was untrue. And maybe that's the case here as well. Maybe it wasn't logical for a pirate crew to be stationed in Sandy Point back in the 1740s and 50s, but it seems likely that detail was added later. Maybe, as earlier versions claimed, they just cruised around the east coast of present-day Prince Edward Island. And sure, no one's been able to find Cobham's confession, but maybe he changed his name once he arrived in France. Or maybe the document was simply lost sometime in the last century. Or maybe the story is right, but the time frame is wrong. Remember, the earliest book that I could find that actually talks about the couple, the pirates' who's who, never says when Cobham and Maria were cruising around Canada. Today, the legend says they arrived in 1740, but Dutch writer Arne Zeethoek seems to have a different take. If you get a copy of his monumental work, The Pirate Encyclopedia, and turn to page 178, you'll find a few entries under the name Cobham. One is for Thomas Cobham, the aforementioned nobleman and privateer from the 1560s. Another is a short entry for Eric Cobham that simply reads, Canada, active circa 1710, fiction. Now, that year, 1710, is intriguing since the legend says they were active in 1740. A difference of 30 years can make a big difference if you're searching through historical records. But wait, there's more. There's a third entry as well. Like in the pirates' who's who, this third Cobham in the Pirate Encyclopedia doesn't have a first name. And while there's no mention of Ile Royale, Ile Saint-Jean, Newfoundland, or Canada, there are many of the details we've come to expect. A 14-gun cutter, a woman named Maria Lindsay who joined him at sea and proved to be a formidable fighter, and a cushy retirement in Le Havre, complete with a luxury yacht and the tragic suicide of his partner. Most interesting, however, is that Zeethoek gives us the specific year that Lindsay joined Cobham's crew. 1663. That's a full 77 years earlier than the traditional story, but still during the Canadian fur trade, and right in that sweet spot when fishing vessels and merchant ships of the Newfoundland coast were easy targets, and when piracy was somewhat common. Plus, Sandy Point, Newfoundland would have been a little quieter, at least for a while, making it perhaps a better safe haven for an enterprising pirate crew. Now, could Zeethoek be mistaken? Or could it be that Cobham and Lindsay did exist, but in the 1660s rather than the 1740s? Could it be that storytellers have been repeating the same wrong time frame for decades, and that researchers like Dr. Jansen have simply been looking for evidence of their exploits in the wrong century? I know it's a long shot, but it gives legend lovers like me a little more hope. Unfortunately, like virtually everything else about this story, the answer is unclear. I'm not sure where Arne Zeethoek got his information. He doesn't make that clear. His primary source seems to be Philip Gosse, so we're back to where we started. He also quotes that mysterious book, Lives of the Most Celebrated Pirates by a sea captain, but it seems he couldn't actually find a copy of the book either, as it's not listed in his official bibliography. Historians are skeptical, locals are believers. Whichever side you happen to be on, you have to admit that the legend of Eric Cobham and Maria Lindsay makes for a great story, and a good way to share the history, folklore, and culture of early Canada. In the end, it's up to us to keep these stories alive, and who knows, maybe someday some Canadian researcher will stumble upon a tattered yellow manuscript tucked away in some forgotten corner of the French National Archives and finally prove, beyond all doubt, that Eric Cobham and Maria Lindsay once held court on our eastern shores as the pirate king and queen of Canada. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and for joining me in becoming part of a Canadian folk tradition. Now that you know the story, share it. And remember, in the timeless words of some pirate somewhere, dead cats don't meow.